The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of the dusty general store, and Eleanor Mae Kendrick gripped the worn leather handle until her knuckles turned white, wondering if the man waiting for her would send her back east the moment he heard her speak. Or rather, the moment he realized she barely spoke at all. It was late spring in 1882, and Gunnison, Colorado sprawled before her like a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. The Rocky Mountains loomed in the distance, their peaks still capped with snow despite the warming weather. Eleanor had traveled from Boston, leaving behind a city that had grown too loud, too demanding, too insistent that she explain herself at every turn. Her aunt had called her unnatural. Her former employer had called her simple. The other seamstresses at the dress shop had whispered behind their hands that something must be wrong with her tongue. There was nothing wrong with her tongue. Eleanor simply found that most words people spoke were unnecessary. Filling Chinese letter, air that could be filled with more honest things, like the sound of breathing or the rustle of fabric, or the way silence itself could tell you everything you needed to know about a person if you just listened. The advertisement had been simple. Rancher in Colorado Territory seeks companionship, must be hardworking, honest, and of good character. Correspondence welcomed. She had written 3 letters to Callum Yancy, each one carefully composed, each one honest about her nature. "I am not given to excessive conversation," she had written in the second letter. "Some have called this a failing. I hope you will not find it so." His response had surprised her. "I have lived alone on this ranch for 5 years since my parents passed. I find that the wind and the cattle and the mountains speak more truth than most men I have known. Perhaps we shall understand one another." Now, stepping down from the stagecoach with her single trunk and carpetbag, Eleanor searched the faces of the men gathered outside the general store. She had only a small photograph, worn at the edges from handling, showing a tall man with dark hair and serious eyes. He stood slightly apart from a fence, one hand resting on a post, looking at something beyond the camera's frame. "Miss Kendrick." A deep voice cut through the afternoon air. She turned, and there he was. Callum Yancy stood a head taller than the other men, his shoulders broad beneath a work-worn shirt, his face weathered by sun and wind. He held his hat in his hands, turning it slowly, and his eyes met hers with an expression she couldn't quite name. Not disappointment. Not enthusiasm. Something more like careful hope. Eleanor nodded. She could feel the eyes of the townspeople on them, curious, judging. This was the moment when she was supposed to speak, to offer some greeting, some pleasant observation about the journey or the weather. Her throat tightened. "The stage was on time," Callum said, filling the silence. "That's unusual. You must have had a good driver." She nodded again, grateful. He picked up her trunk as though it weighed nothing and gestured toward a wagon. "The ranch is about an hour's ride. If you are hungry, we can stop at the hotel first. Mrs. Chen keeps a good kitchen." Eleanor shook her head. She wanted to leave the curious stares behind to see this place that might become her home. Callum seemed to understand. He loaded her belongings into the wagon and helped her up onto the seat. His hand was calloused and warm, and he released her fingers as soon as she was settled, respecting the space between them. They rode out of town in silence. Eleanor watched the landscape unfold around her, so different from Boston's brick and cobblestone. Here, the earth seemed to breathe. Sagebrush dotted the rolling hills and aspens clustered near a creek that ran parallel to the road. The air smelled of pine and distance and possibility. "Some people cannot abide the quiet out here," Callum said after they had been riding for 20 minutes. "My mother was from St. Louis. She loved my father, but she found the silence of the ranch difficult. She used to sing constantly just to fill the air with sound. Eleanor glanced at him. He kept his eyes on the road, his hands steady on the reins. "I never minded it," he continued. "The silence, I mean. After they died, fever took them both within a week. I thought the quiet would drive me mad. Everyone said it would. But instead, I found it was the only thing that made sense. Words had not saved them. Prayers had not saved them. But the wind still blew, and the cattle still needed tending, and the mountains still stood. There was honesty in that." Eleanor felt something loosen in her chest. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small notebook and pencil she always carried. She wrote quickly and handed it to him. "I understand," he read aloud. Then he looked at her, really looked at her, and something shifted in his expression. "You write your words." She nodded and took the notebook back. She wrote again. "Only when necessary. Most things do not require words." Callum read this and was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Most people think I am strange for believing that." She wrote, "Most people talk too much." For the first time since she had arrived, Callum smiled. It transformed his face, softening the hard edges the sun and work had carved there. "Miss Kendrick, I believe we may get along just fine." The ranch appeared over a rise, nestled in a valley with the mountains as a backdrop. The house was modest, built of logs with a stone chimney, but it looked solid and well-maintained. A barn stood nearby, larger than the house, and she could see cattle grazing in the distant fields. A garden plot had been fenced off near the house, though it looked somewhat neglected. "I have not had much success with vegetables," Callum admitted as he helped her down from the wagon. "I can keep cattle alive through the winter, but tomatoes seem beyond my abilities." Eleanor examined the garden. The fence was good, but the soil looked depleted. She would need compost, and the placement was wrong for the afternoon sun. She turned to him and pointed at a spot closer to the house, then made a digging motion. "You want to move the garden?" he asked. She nodded and wrote in her notebook, "Better, son. I can grow vegetables." "I worked in a garden in Boston." "Then it is yours to command," Callum said. "I will help you dig wherever you think best." He showed her the house. It was clean, surprisingly so for a bachelor's home, but sparse. The furniture was handmade and practical. A large fireplace dominated the main room, and she could see a bedroom off to one side and a ladder leading to a loft. "I thought you might want the bedroom," Callum said, and there was awkwardness in his voice now. "I can sleep in the loft." "We can." "That is, I know we have corresponded, but we are still strangers. I do not expect." Eleanor turned to him and wrote quickly, "Thank you. That is kind." He nodded, relief evident in his face. "There is a reverend in town, Reverend Matthews. When you are ready, if you are ready, we can have him come out, or we can wait. I am a patient man." She appreciated that. She wrote, "I would like to know you first." "That seems wise," Callum agreed. "I will leave you to settle in. There is a well out back, and I brought water in this morning. If you need anything, I will be in the barn tending to a mare who is about to foal." After he left, Eleanor stood in the center of the main room and let herself breathe. This place was so far from everything she had known, and yet something about it felt right. The silence here was different from the silence she had endured in Boston. There, her silence had been a void that others tried to fill with criticism and concern. Here, silence was simply the natural state of things. She unpacked her belongings, hanging her 3 dresses on pegs in the bedroom, arranging her few books on a shelf, and placing the photograph of her parents on the small table beside the bed. Her mother had died when she was 12, her father 2 years later. She had lived with her aunt since then, and those had been hard years. Her aunt believed that silence was defiance, that Eleanor's quiet nature was a deliberate rebellion against God and propriety. But Eleanor knew better. She had always been this way, even as a child. She had spoken when necessary, but she found that she could understand the world better when she was listening rather than talking. She could hear the things people did not say. She could feel the truth beneath their words. And she had learned that her presence, her attention, her actions spoke louder than any words she might offer. That evening, Callum returned to the house as the sun was setting. He looked tired but satisfied. "The foal came," he said. "A filly, strong and healthy. Would you like to see?" Eleanor nodded immediately. She followed him to the barn, where a chestnut mare stood protectively over her newborn. The foal was all legs and curiosity, already attempting to stand on shaky limbs. Eleanor approached slowly, letting the mare see her, and then she knelt in the straw beside the foal. She reached out and let the little horse sniff her hand. Its nose was soft as velvet, its breath warm and sweet. She ran her hand gently along its neck, and the foal leaned into the touch. "She likes you," Callum said from behind her. "Animals can sense things about people." This mare is usually wary of strangers. Eleanor looked up at him and smiled. She did not need words to express her joy at this moment, and she could see that he understood. They walked back to the house together through the twilight. Callum had made a simple dinner of beans, bacon, and bread. It was plain food but hearty, and Eleanor ate gratefully. Afterwards, she cleaned the dishes while he sat at the table, writing in a ledger. "I am not much of a cook," he admitted. "If you can improve on beans and bacon, I will be in your debt." She wrote, "I can cook. My aunt insisted I learn." "Then we will both benefit from your presence," Callum said. "I confess, Miss Kendrick, I was uncertain about this arrangement. The men in town think I am foolish. They say a woman needs to chatter, to have company, to go to socials and dances. They warned me that a mail-order bride might expect things I cannot provide. But I am a simple man. I have this ranch, and I have the work I do, and I have the quiet. I had hoped to find someone who might share these things without requiring me to be something I am not." Eleanor set down the dish she was washing and dried her hands. She wrote at length in her notebook, then turned it so he could read. "I have spent my life being told I am not enough because I do not fill the air with words. People are uncomfortable with silence. They think it means something is wrong, that I am angry or sad or simple-minded. But I am none of those things. I simply find that silence is honest, and words are often not. I can hear the truth in quiet. I can understand what people mean by what they do, not just by what they say. I came here hoping to find someone who would not require me to be something I am not, either." Callum read this carefully, then looked up at her. His eyes were bright in the lamplight. "Your silence speaks volumes to me," he said quietly. "I see you watching, listening, understanding. I see you with the mare, with the foal, with the garden. You do not need words to show me who you are. And what I see, Miss Kendrick, gives me great hope that we will suit each other well." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks. She nodded and returned to the dishes, but something had shifted between them. An understanding had been reached, one that went deeper than any words could have established. The days that followed developed a rhythm. Eleanor rose early and made breakfast while Callum tended to the animals. She discovered that he was right about his cooking, but he was an excellent rancher. His cattle were healthy, his horses well trained, his fences maintained. He worked hard from dawn until dusk, but he was never too busy to help her when she needed it. Together, they dug a new garden plot in the location she had indicated. Callum followed her instructions without question, and she appreciated that he trusted her judgment. She planted seeds she had brought from Boston and some she purchased in town: tomatoes, beans, squash, carrots, and herbs. She created a compost pile and began enriching the soil. Each evening, she would walk through the garden, checking the progress, pulling weeds, and Callum would often join her, standing nearby in companionable silence, 3 weeks after her arrival, they rode into town together for supplies. Eleanor wore her best dress, a simple blue calico, and Callum had shaved and put on a clean shirt. They made their purchases at the general store, where Mrs. Patterson, the shopkeeper's wife, tried repeatedly to draw Eleanor into conversation. "And how are you finding Colorado, dear? So different from Boston, I imagine. Do you miss the city? Are you settling in well? Is the ranch to your liking?" Eleanor nodded politely to each question but offered no elaboration. She could feel Mrs. Patterson's frustration growing. "Is she simple, Mrs. Patterson?" finally asked Callum, as though Eleanor were not standing right there. Callum's jaw tightened. "She is not simple. She is thoughtful. There is a difference. But she does not speak." "She speaks when she has something worth saying," Callum replied. "Perhaps more people should adopt that practice." Eleanor touched his arm gently, grateful but not wanting him to make enemies on her behalf. She pulled out her notebook and wrote, "I am happy at the ranch. Thank you for asking." Mrs. Patterson read this and sniffed. "Well, I suppose that is clear enough." Outside the store, Callum was still angry. People can be cruel without meaning to be, or perhaps they do mean to be. I cannot always tell. Eleanor wrote, "It does not matter. You defended me, that matters." "You should not have to be defended for being who you are," Callum said. "Neither should you," she wrote, and he looked at her with such gratitude that she felt her heart squeeze. On the way home, they stopped by the church. Reverend Matthews was a kind man in his 50s, with gray hair and gentle eyes. He invited them into his study. "Mr. Yancy, Miss Kendrick, what can I do for you?" Callum looked at Eleanor. She looked back at him. A month had passed, and in that month she had learned his rhythms as he had learned hers. She knew he took his coffee black and strong. She knew he favored his left leg slightly, an old injury from a fall. She knew he sang quietly to the horses when he thought no one could hear, old songs his mother had taught him. She knew he was kind and patient and honest, and that he looked at her not as though she were broken, but as though she were exactly who she was supposed to be. She nodded. "We would like to be married," Callum said, "if Miss Kendrick is willing." "I am willing," Eleanor said aloud. Her voice was soft from disuse but steady. Both men looked at her in surprise. Callum's eyes widened. "You do not have to speak," he said quickly. "I do not require it." "I know," Eleanor said, "but I want to for this." Reverend Matthews smiled. "Then I will be honored to perform the ceremony. When would you like to do this?" "Now," Callum said, looking at Eleanor, "if that suits you." "Now," she agreed. They were married in the small church with only Reverend Matthews and his wife as witnesses. Eleanor wore her blue dress, and Callum held her hands as though they were precious, breakable things. When the Reverend asked if she took this man to be her husband, she said, "I do," clearly, and she saw Callum's eyes grow bright with emotion. When he asked Callum the same question, his response was firm and sure. "I do." "You may kiss your bride," Reverend Matthews said. Callum leaned down slowly, giving her time to move away if she wished. But Eleanor did not move away. She tilted her face up, and when his lips met hers, she felt as though she had come home to a place she had never known existed. The kiss was gentle, respectful, but beneath it, she felt the promise of more, of a future built on understanding and acceptance, and something that was beginning to feel like love. They rode back to the ranch as husband and wife. The sun was setting, painting the mountains gold and pink. Callum helped her down from the wagon and held her hand as they walked to the house. "I know we have been living as strangers under one roof," he said. "That can change, or it can continue as it has been. You may decide. I will not press you." Eleanor squeezed his hand and led him inside. She did not need to write, and she did not need to speak. She simply took him to the bedroom that had been hers alone and opened the door, then looked at him with a question in her eyes. "Are you certain?" he asked. She nodded. That night, they came together with a tenderness that brought tears to Eleanor's eyes. Callum was patient, careful, asking with his hands and his eyes what he did not ask with words. And Eleanor answered in kind, showing him with touch what she could not say aloud. When they lay together afterward, his arm around her, her head on his chest, she felt the steady beat of his heart and knew that she had made the right choice. The summer passed in a haze of work and growing affection. The garden flourished under Eleanor's care, providing fresh vegetables for their table and enough extra to trade in town. The foal grew strong and playful, and Eleanor spent hours in the pasture watching her run. Callum taught her to ride, first on the gentle mare, then on one of his saddle horses, a patient gelding named Duke. She proved to be a natural rider, and soon they were riding together through the mountain meadows, exploring the vast expanse of land that surrounded the ranch. One evening in late July, as they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge, Callum said, "I find myself thinking thoughts I did not expect to think." Eleanor looked at him questioningly. "I am happy," he said simply. "I had thought perhaps I would never be truly happy again after my parents died. I thought perhaps I had used up my allotment of happiness. But you have brought something back to me that I thought was gone forever." Eleanor took his hand and held it tightly. She leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat that way until the moon rose full and bright over the mountains. But happiness, Eleanor had learned, was often interrupted by hardship. In August, a sickness came through the valley. It started in town, a fever that struck quickly and viciously. Reverend Matthews's wife took ill first, then several children, then men and women throughout Gunnison. Eleanor and Callum had gone to town for supplies when they heard the news. Mrs. Patterson was closing the store early, her face drawn with worry. "My nephew is sick," she said. "And the Hutchinson twins and old Mr. Brady. Doc Morrison is overwhelmed. He is asking for anyone with nursing experience to help." Eleanor did not hesitate. She wrote quickly, "I will help." "You should not," Callum said. "If you are exposed, you might fall ill." Eleanor wrote, "People need help, I must go." Callum read this and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Then I will come with you." "No," Eleanor said aloud, the word surprising them both. "The ranch, the animals, someone must tend them." "Eleanor, please," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I can do this. Let me do this." He struggled with it, she could see, but finally he nodded. "I will bring you back to town each morning and collect you each evening. You will not stay overnight where you might be exposed continuously." It was a compromise, and Eleanor accepted it. For 2 weeks, she worked alongside Doc Morrison and the other women who had volunteered. She bathed fevered brows, spooned broth into unwilling mouths, changed soiled linens, and sat vigil through long nights. Her silence proved an asset. The sick did not need conversation. They needed steady, calm presence. They needed someone who would not flinch from the hard work of caring for ravaged bodies. Doc Morrison, a gruff man in his 60s, took notice of her. "You have a gift for this," he told her one evening. "You are not afraid and you do not tire easily." "Where did you learn nursing?" Eleanor wrote. "I cared for my father when he was dying. I learned by necessity." "Well, you learned well," Doc Morrison said. "If you ever want to train formally, I would be happy to teach you." Eleanor was exhausted by the end of each day, and Callum would arrive with the wagon to take her home. He would not touch her until she had washed thoroughly and changed her clothes, but then he would hold her while she slept, and in the morning he would have breakfast ready and a packed lunch for her to take. "You are extraordinary," he told her one morning. "I hope you know that." Eleanor kissed him and returned to town. The fever broke in the 3rd week. Of those who had fallen ill, most recovered, though two of the Hutchinson twins and old Mr. Brady did not survive. Eleanor attended both funerals, standing silently as the community mourned. Mrs. Patterson approached her afterward. "I misjudged you," the older woman said. "I thought you were cold because you did not speak, but I have seen you these past weeks. You have more compassion in your silence than most people have in all their words. I am sorry for what I said." Eleanor smiled and nodded, accepting the apology with grace. On the way home that day, Callum was quiet. Finally, he said, "I was terrified every day. I was terrified that you would catch the fever, that I would lose you just as I found you, but I am also proud. You did what needed to be done without fanfare, without expectation of thanks. You simply helped because people needed helping." Eleanor wrote, "You would have done the same." "Perhaps," Callum said, "but perhaps not as well." Autumn came to the mountains in a blaze of gold and red. The aspen trees turned brilliant yellow, and the nights grew cold. Callum and Eleanor worked together to prepare the ranch for winter, repairing fences, stocking supplies, and ensuring the cattle would have adequate shelter. Eleanor canned vegetables from the garden, filling shelves in the root cellar with jars of tomatoes, beans, and pickles. She baked bread and dried herbs and felt a satisfaction she had never known in Boston. One evening in October, as they lay in bed, Eleanor felt a familiar absence and realized what it meant. She was quiet for several days, waiting to be certain, and then she wrote a note and left it on the table for Callum to find at breakfast. "I believe I am with child." She watched from the doorway as he read it. He went very still, then looked up at her with wonder in his eyes. "Truly," she nodded. He crossed the room in 3 strides and lifted her off her feet, spinning her around. "Eleanor, my Eleanor, this is the best news I could have imagined." She laughed, a sound so rare that it startled them both, and he set her down gently, his hands cradling her face. "Are you happy?" he asked. "Yes," she said aloud. "Very happy." The winter was hard, as mountain winters always were. Snow piled high against the house, and the wind howled through the valley. But inside, the house was warm, and Eleanor and Callum weathered the cold months together. He read to her in the evenings from books she had brought from Boston, poetry, novels, philosophy. She knitted small garments for the baby and sewed a quilt from scraps of fabric. On a particularly bitter night in January, Callum stoked the fire and sat beside her on the sofa. "I have been thinking," he said, "about names." Eleanor looked at him expectantly. "If it is a boy, I would like to name him after my father, James, but only if you agree." "What names do you favor?" Eleanor wrote. "James is good. If a girl, I would like Claire for my mother." "James or Claire Yancy," Callum said, testing the names. "Both are fine names. And this child will be lucky to have you as a mother." "And you as a father," Eleanor wrote. He kissed her temple. "We will do our best. That is all anyone can do." The baby came in late April, just as the wildflowers were beginning to bloom in the meadows. The labor was long and difficult, and Doc Morrison, who had ridden out from town despite the muddy roads, worked through the night to ensure both mother and child survived. Callum paced outside the bedroom, and when he finally heard the cry of his son, he leaned against the wall and wept. Doc Morrison emerged, tired but smiling. "You have a healthy boy, and your wife is made of stronger stuff than most. She never cried out once, though I know the pain was considerable." Callum entered the bedroom to find Eleanor propped up against the pillows, exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle. The baby had a shock of dark hair and was wailing with impressive volume. "He has your lungs," Callum said, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed. "Or perhaps he has enough voice for both of you." Eleanor smiled and placed the baby in Callum's arms. He looked down at his son with such awe that Eleanor felt tears slip down her cheeks. "Hello, James," Callum whispered. "Welcome to the world, my son." James proved to be a healthy, happy baby. He ate well and slept reasonably well, and as the months passed, he began to smile and laugh and reach for the faces of his parents. Eleanor discovered that motherhood suited her. She could comfort James without words, understanding his needs through his cries and his movements. Callum was a devoted father, carrying the baby in a sling while he worked around the ranch, talking to him constantly as though making up for Eleanor's silence. "Someone in this family should be a talker," he joked one evening as James babbled nonsense sounds from his cradle. Eleanor wrote, "He will choose his own way." "That he will," Callum agreed, "and we will love him regardless." When James was 6 months old, they made the trip to town for the first time as a family. The townspeople cooed over the baby, and Eleanor found herself more accepted than she had been before. Motherhood, it seemed, was a universal language. Mrs. Patterson held James and said, "He is beautiful. You must be so proud." Eleanor nodded and wrote, "Very proud. He is our joy." "Will you have more?" Mrs. Patterson asked. Eleanor glanced at Callum, who raised an eyebrow in question. She wrote, "Perhaps, if we are blessed." They were blessed. 2 years after James was born, Eleanor delivered a daughter. They named her Claire, and she was smaller than her brother had been, with her mother's delicate features and her father's dark eyes. Callum cried again when he held her, overcome with the miracle of this tiny person. "2 children," he said to Eleanor that night. "2 healthy, beautiful children." "How did I become so fortunate?" Eleanor wrote. "We are fortunate together." The years passed in a rhythm of seasons and growth. James grew tall and strong, learning to ride almost before he could walk properly. Claire was quieter than her brother, more thoughtful, and Eleanor saw something of herself in the little girl. Claire would sit for long periods watching the world around her, absorbing everything with wide, serious eyes. "Is she too quiet?" Callum asked Eleanor one evening when Claire was 3. "Should we be concerned?" Eleanor wrote. "She is perfect as she is. She is simply watching, learning. Some children are like this." "Like you," Callum said. "Perhaps," Eleanor wrote. "Or perhaps she is simply Claire. Let her be who she is." Callum nodded, trusting her judgment. Claire did speak, but sparingly, and she seemed to prefer her mother's company to anyone else's. The bond between them was profound and unspoken, a connection that needed no words to be understood. James, on the other hand, was all energy and questions. He talked constantly, asking about everything from why the sky was blue to how the cattle knew where to find grass. Callum answered his questions patiently, and Eleanor marveled at how her silent nature and her son's vocal one could exist in perfect harmony. When James was 8 and Claire was 6, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant again. This pregnancy was harder than the previous 2. She was older now, and the work of the ranch combined with caring for 2 children had taken its toll. Doc Morrison insisted she rest more, and Callum hired a young man from town, Peter Sullivan, to help with the heavy work. Eleanor chafed at the restriction but knew it was necessary. She spent her days supervising the children, tending the garden from a chair Callum had placed in the shade, and sewing. Claire stayed close to her, seeming to sense that her mother needed extra care. The little girl would bring her water, fetch things she needed, and sit quietly beside her, offering comfort through her presence. The baby, another boy, came early in the night during a summer storm. Lightning cracked across the sky, and thunder shook the house as Eleanor labored. Doc Morrison had stayed overnight, sensing the birth was imminent, and Callum held Eleanor's hand through each contraction, murmuring encouragement. "You are so strong," he told her. "You can do this. I am here. I am right here." When the baby was born, smaller than his siblings had been but with a lusty cry, Doc Morrison placed him in Eleanor's arms and said, "Another son. You are blessed, Mrs. Yancy." They named him Thomas after Callum's grandfather. Thomas was a sweet-natured baby who smiled early and often. James and Claire were fascinated by their new brother, and Eleanor often found them standing over his cradle, whispering to him or simply watching him sleep. The ranch prospered. Callum's herd had grown, and he had established a reputation for raising quality cattle. Other ranchers came to him for advice, and he was elected to serve on the town council. Eleanor expanded her garden each year, and her preserves became sought after in Gunnison. She traded them for goods the family needed, and she took quiet pride in contributing to their success. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Callum surprised Eleanor by taking her on a trip. His sister, Margaret, whom Eleanor had met only once, agreed to come stay with the children for a week. Callum and Eleanor rode to Crested Butte, a mining town nestled higher in the mountains, where they stayed in a small hotel and spent their days walking through wildflower meadows and their nights alone together, talking and loving and simply being. "I cannot believe it has been 10 years, Callum said one evening as they sat watching the sunset paint the peaks pink and orange. "It feels like yesterday that I picked you up from the stage, so quiet and uncertain. And yet it also feels like you have been with me forever, like I cannot remember what life was like before you." Eleanor leaned against him and wrote in the notebook she still carried, "Best 10 years of my life." "Mine as well," Callum said. "Do you have any regrets?" "Anything you wish had been different?" Eleanor thought about this seriously. She wrote, "No regrets, only gratitude. Even though I am a simple rancher, even though we have not traveled or lived in fine houses or attended grand parties, especially because of those things," Eleanor wrote. "This life suits me, you suit me, the children suit me, I need nothing more." Callum kissed her then, long and deep, and they returned to the hotel room as the stars began to appear. The children grew. James, at 15, was already as tall as his father and working the ranch with the skill of a man twice his age. He had his father's steady nature and his mother's ability to observe and understand without needing constant explanation. He was courting a girl from town, Anna Harris, the daughter of the blacksmith, and Eleanor could see the way his eyes lit up when he spoke of her. Claire, at 13, remained quiet and thoughtful. She had become an accomplished artist, drawing and painting the landscapes around the ranch with remarkable skill. Doc Morrison had taken her under his wing, teaching her about herbs and medicine, and Eleanor knew her daughter would likely follow that path. Claire spoke more than her mother did, but she chose her words carefully, and people in town had learned to value her observations. Thomas, at 7, was the family clown. He was always laughing, always getting into mischief, always finding ways to make his siblings smile. He adored his mother and would sit in her lap long past the age when most boys insisted on independence, content to simply be held. One autumn evening, when the children were occupied with their own activities, Callum and Eleanor sat on the porch as they had done countless times over the years. The sunset was particularly beautiful, all gold and crimson, and the air was crisp with the promise of coming winter. "You remember what I said to you early on?" Callum asked. "That your silence speaks volumes to me," Eleanor nodded. "I want you to know that I meant it then, and I mean it even more now. In 20 years of knowing you, 10 years of marriage, you have taught me more about communication than all the talkers in the world could have. You have shown me that love is not in the words we say, but in the way we show up for each other. In the way you nursed strangers through a fever. In the way you birthed our children with such courage. in the way you tend this home and this family with steady, quiet devotion. Your silence is not an absence, it is a presence powerful and true. Eleanor felt tears gathering. She took out her notebook and wrote for a long time. When she finished, she handed it to him. You gave me something I never had before. You gave me acceptance. You looked at me and saw not a flaw to be corrected, but a person to be valued. You defended me when others questioned. You trusted me when I needed to help during the fever, even though you were afraid. You built a life with me based not on words, but on understanding. You have been my partner, my love, my home. I speak more now than I did when I arrived, not because you required it, but because I felt safe enough to find my voice. But I still prefer silence most of the time, and you have never made me feel that this is wrong. You are the best man I have ever known, and I thank God every day that I answered your advertisement and came to Colorado. Callum read this with tears streaming down his face. He pulled Eleanor into his arms and held her tightly. I love you, he whispered. I love you more than I have words to express. I love you too, Eleanor said aloud, her voice soft but clear. They sat together as the sun disappeared behind the mountains and the stars emerged one by one. Inside the house, they could hear James laughing at something Thomas said and Claire's voice joining in. The sound of their family, healthy and happy and whole, was sweeter than any music. The years continued to pass, bringing changes and challenges. James married Anna Harris in a beautiful ceremony at the church in Gunnison. Eleanor cried as she watched her son pledge his love, remembering her own wedding day in that same church. James and Anna built a house on the far side of the ranch property, and soon they had children of their own, making Eleanor and Callum grandparents. Claire, as expected, became an apprentice to Doc Morrison, learning medicine and healing with the same quiet dedication her mother brought to everything. She also continued her painting, and her artwork began to sell in Denver, brought to the city by a merchant who recognized her talent. She never married, seeming content with her work and her art and the occasional visits from a surveyor named Daniel who came through Gunnison each summer. Thomas, the baby, surprised everyone by developing a passion for horses. By the time he was 16, he was training horses for ranchers throughout the valley, with a reputation for gentleness and skill. He met a girl at a horse auction, a rancher's daughter from Wyoming named Sarah, and fell hard and fast. They married when he was 19, and she brought her own horse knowledge to the ranch, expanding their operation. Eleanor and Callum, now in their 50s, settled into the rhythms of older life. The ranch was primarily run by James and Thomas now, though Callum still worked every day, unable to imagine a life of leisure. Eleanor still tended her garden, though it was smaller now, easier to manage. She had taken up writing, filling journals with her observations and thoughts, creating a record of their life for her children and grandchildren to read someday. On a warm spring morning, Eleanor walked out to find Callum standing in the meadow where they used to ride together. He was looking at the mountains, his profile strong despite the silver in his hair and beard. She approached quietly and slipped her hand into his. I was remembering, he said without looking away from the mountains. That first day when I picked you up from the stage, I was so nervous. I thought perhaps you would take one look at me at this place and demand to be sent back. I thought I was asking too much, expecting a woman from Boston to build a life in this wild place. Eleanor squeezed his hand. But you surprised me. You have spent our entire marriage surprising me. You are stronger than I ever imagined, braver, kinder. You made this house a home. You raised our children with wisdom and love. You became a part of this community, even though they did not understand you at first. You did all of this without needing to be anyone other than who you are. Eleanor pulled out the small notebook she still carried, though she needed it less now. She wrote, "We built this life together. Every step." "We did," Callum agreed. "And I would not change a single moment, not the hard winters or the difficult births or the fever or any of it. Because all of it led to this, to standing here with you, surrounded by the family we created on the land we have worked, under these mountains that have witnessed our love." Eleanor turned to face him. She reached up and cupped his weathered face in her hands. "I love you," she said clearly. "Then, now, always." "And I love you," Callum said. "Your silence speaks volumes to me, Eleanor. It always has. It always will." He kissed her there in the meadow, with the mountains watching and the spring breeze carrying the scent of new grass and wildflowers. When they finally pulled apart, Eleanor took his hand and they walked back to the house together, their steps in sync, their hearts beating as one. That evening, the family gathered for dinner. James and Anna brought their 3 children. Claire arrived with sketches from her latest project, and Thomas and Sarah came with stories about a wild Mustang Thomas was attempting to train. The house was full of noise and laughter and love, so different from the quiet evenings of early marriage, but no less precious. Eleanor watched from her place at the table as Callum told a story that made the grandchildren giggle. She watched Claire help Anna with the dishes while discussing a difficult medical case. She watched James and Thomas argue good-naturedly about cattle breeding. She watched the life they had built unfold around her in all its messy, beautiful reality. After everyone had gone home and the house was quiet again, Eleanor and Callum prepared for bed. As they lay together in the darkness, Callum's arm around her waist, Eleanor thought about the journey that had brought her here. The train from Boston, the stage coach to Gunnison, the wagon ride to the ranch. Every mile had been a step toward this life, this man, this love. "What are you thinking about?" Callum asked softly. Eleanor did not need her notebook in the dark. She had learned to use her voice when it mattered, when the words needed to be spoken aloud. "I am thinking that I am exactly where I am meant to be." "As am I," Callum said. "As am I." They fell asleep that way as they had for 30 years of marriage, 2 people who had found in each other a language that transcended words. In the morning, they would wake and begin another day of work and love and life. But for now, in the quiet darkness, with the mountains standing eternal outside their window, they simply rested, complete and content. The seasons turned. Summer gave way to autumn, autumn to winter, winter to spring. Eleanor's garden bloomed year after year. The cattle grazed in the meadows. The horses ran free in the pastures. Children were born, grew up, and had children of their own. Through it all, Eleanor and Callum remained constants, their love deepening with each passing year, their understanding of each other growing more profound in its silence. When Eleanor was 62, she became ill. It started as a cough that would not go away, then developed into something more serious. Doc Morrison, now quite elderly himself, examined her with Claire assisting, and his face was grave when he finished. "I am sorry," he said to Callum. "Her lungs are badly inflamed." At her age, with her history of hard work and exposure to the elements, recovery will be difficult. Callum refused to accept this. He tended Eleanor with the same devotion she had shown to the fever victims all those years ago. He made her broth and helped her drink it when she was too weak to hold the cup. He read to her when she could not sleep. He held her hand and told her stories of their life together, remembering every detail, every moment, every precious memory. Claire came every day, bringing medicines and her healing knowledge. James and Anna took over all the ranch work, insisting that Callum focus on his wife. Thomas and Sarah managed the horses and brought their children to sit quietly with their grandmother. offering her the gift of their young presence. Eleanor fought the illness with the same quiet strength she had brought to everything in her life. She did not complain about the pain or the difficulty breathing. She simply persevered, day after day, slowly regaining her strength. It took months, but by spring she was able to sit in a chair in the garden, watching the plants emerge from the cold earth. "You scared me," Callum told her one afternoon as they sat together in the sun. "I thought I might lose you, and I realized that I am not ready. I will never be ready. I need you, Eleanor. I have always needed you." Eleanor took his hand and squeezed it. Her voice was still weak from the illness, but she managed, "I am here, still here." "Thank God for that," Callum said fervently. She recovered fully by summer, thinner and more frail than before, but alive and determined. She returned to her routines, though she moved more slowly now, and she accepted help more readily. The family rallied around her, protective and loving, and she was grateful for each of them. On their 40th wedding anniversary, the entire family gathered at the ranch. James and Anna, now with 5 grown children and 2 grandchildren of their own. Claire, finally married at 50 to her surveyor Daniel, living part of the year in Gunnison and part in Denver. Thomas and Sarah with their 4 children, all of them horse-mad like their father. The house overflowed with people, multiple generations of the family Eleanor and Callum had created. They held a celebration in the meadow, with tables of food and music from a fiddle player Thomas had hired. As the sun began to set, Callum stood and raised his glass. 40 years ago, I married the most remarkable woman I have ever known. She came to me from Boston, a stranger answering an advertisement, and she has been my partner, my love, my home ever since. Eleanor does not speak often, but when she does, her words carry the weight of truth and wisdom. Mostly, though, she communicates in other ways. Through her actions, her presence, her steady devotion to all of us. She has taught me that silence can be its own language, that understanding does not require constant conversation, that love is shown not in what we say, but in what we do. To Eleanor, my wife, my heart, my everything. Everyone raised their glasses and cheered. Eleanor stood and the crowd quieted, knowing that if she was going to speak, it was an occasion to witness. 40 years ago, she said, her voice soft but carrying in the evening air. I stepped off a stagecoach, terrified and hopeful. I had been told my whole life that my silence was a flaw, that I was too quiet, too strange, too much myself. But Callum looked at me and said that my silence spoke volumes to him. He saw me, truly saw me, and he loved what he saw. He gave me a home, a family, a life beyond anything I could have imagined. He gave me acceptance and freedom to be exactly who I am. These 40 years have been the greatest gift. And all of you, our children, our grandchildren, you are the legacy of that gift. You are the proof that love built on understanding, on acceptance, on seeing each other clearly, creates something that lasts. I love you all. And I love you, Callum Yancy, more than any words could ever express. She sat down to thunderous applause, and Callum pulled her into his arms, not caring who saw, not caring about anything except the woman in his embrace. They danced later, swaying slowly to the fiddle music, and Eleanor rested her head on his shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart, the same heart that had welcomed her 40 years ago. As the years continued, Eleanor and Callum grew old together with grace and gratitude. They moved more slowly, worked less, rested more. But they still took their evening walks when the weather permitted. They still sat on the porch watching sunsets. They still communicated in the silent language they had developed over decades of partnership. Eleanor passed quietly in her sleep at the age of 73, with Callum beside her as he had been every night of their married life. She simply did not wake one spring morning, slipping away as gently as she had lived. Callum held her for a long time, tears streaming down his face, whispering goodbye to the woman who had been his everything. The funeral was attended by everyone in Gunnison and surrounding ranches. Eleanor had been beloved in her quiet way, respected for her compassion, her skill, her steady presence. Person after person told stories of how she had helped them, usually without words, always with actions that spoke louder than any speech. Callum stood at her grave and said simply, "Your silence still speaks volumes to me, my love. It always will." He lived another 5 years, cared for by his children and grandchildren, still working the ranch when he could, still looking at the mountains with wonder. On quiet evenings, the family would find him on the porch, staring at the spot where Eleanor used to sit, and they knew he was talking to her in the silence they had shared. When Callum finally passed, they buried him beside Eleanor, their graves marked with simple stones bearing their names and a single line. Their silence spoke volumes. The ranch stayed in the family, passing down through the generations, each one remembering the story of the mail-order bride who had been too quiet and the rancher who had loved her for it. James's great-granddaughter, visiting the ranch on a summer day decades later, stood in the meadow where Eleanor and Callum had walked so many times. She held in her hand the journal Eleanor had written, filled with observations and wisdom and love, and she understood finally what her ancestor had known all along. That silence was not emptiness but fullness. That words were not always necessary to communicate truth. That love built on acceptance and understanding could transcend generations, creating a legacy that would never fade. She looked at the mountains, eternal and silent, and she felt the presence of her ancestors in the wind, in the grass, in the quiet that surrounded her. And she smiled, understanding at last that sometimes silence really does speak volumes, especially when it is heard by someone who truly listens.